A former Prime Minister of Australia has said the British colonisation of the island nation was, quote, the luckiest thing that ever happened to it. John Howard made those comments in reference to a potential national vote on whether to include more protections for indigenous people in the Constitution.
I do hold the view that the luckiest thing that happened to this country was being colonised by the British. Not that they were perfect by any means, but they were infinitely more successful and beneficent colonisers than other European countries.
Now, this is quite a shocking comment from Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. And these comments came ahead of a very heated referendum about the representation of Indigenous people in the country, as they are planning to vote on whether to include an Indigenous advisory body in the Parliament. Now, of course, his comments came under fire, and he was heavily criticized on social media, because we must remember that thousands of Indigenous men, women, and children were massacred by the British colonizers in the late 18th century and the early 20th century. Well, of course, we must mention that the British colonizers at the time carried out what is called frontier massacres, which are essentially planned massacres in which the victims are undefended. Now, according to a Guardian article, there were at least 270 frontier massacres over 140 years. Now, this is, of course, an organized attempt to eradicate Indigenous people from their land. And in the late 18th century, the very beginning of the mass killings, they were first carried out by British soldiers, then police, then settlers, and of course, native police as well, that was at the time under the command of the British colonial government. Now, government forces were at the time, of course, actively engaged in these massacres until at least the late 1920s. And there were also efforts to cover these atrocities up. So right now, let's take a look at a very interesting study done by the University of Newcastle on these massacres.
Frontier massacres of Aboriginal people in Australia are a significant component of the violent colonisation of Australia. The overwhelming majority of the victims of frontier massacres are Aboriginal people, killed by colonists. Frontier massacres have a traumatic and enduring impact on Aboriginal communities and are remembered to this day in oral histories, paintings, petroglyphs, and dance. Government agents of the early colonies and later states and territories, such as military and police, were identified as participants in around half of the frontier massacres.
Now, while talking about this history and stating these facts might be sensitive and even surprising to some people, it is very important to be reminded and to acknowledge these atrocities and the horrors of European colonization.
Let's head over now to the UK and speak to Joti Brar. She's the Vice Chairperson of the British Communist Party. Joti, thanks so much for joining us here at RT. Really appreciate it. So many people have come to see the British colonial period as an especially dark and brutal chapter in history. So why are we seeing the former Australian Prime Minister speak out in support of those times, do you think?
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? I mean, Australian colonisation, like so many other of the colonial projects of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was founded on a mass genocide. It was based on violence. It was based on the monopoly of advanced technologies, especially advanced weaponry. And it was justified by the myth of racial supremacy. And this ideology still underpins the outlook of Australia's ruling class and pervades almost every aspect of the social, cultural and educational system in Australia still today. And so it's permeated very deeply into the wider population. You know, Australian workers have been given a privileged position in relation to Aboriginal workers, and that's been justified on the basis of some kind of inherent superiority that's related to skin colour, right? And so I guess that's the root of this kind of controversy over the idea of just allowing some systematic parliamentary voice to First Nation peoples. It's not the most revolutionary demand, in fact, but you can see that the hysteria it's creating is connected to how deeply this racist ideology underpins Australian culture even today.
Yeah, it's interesting. He also sort of suggested, and this is a strange one to me, Jodi, he suggested that the British were better colonizers than other European powers. I mean, it's all wrong, but what do you make of it?
It's an absurd statement to make, but you'll often find that the beneficiaries, the ones who did well out of British colonial projects, will have this prejudice. And we have it ourselves in Britain. You know, we're brought up to think that we were the best empire, we were the civilized empire. Of course, if you go to the places that were, you know, dominated, genocided, looted by British imperialism, they'll have a very different story to tell. You only have to ask people from India how they felt about 200 years of being looted by the Raj, you know, or all over Africa, you know, all over the world, you'll find people who'll tell a very different story. And the truth is that the essence of Australian colonisation is the same as many of the other colonial projects. It was based in massacres, in dehumanizing the local population, subjecting them to all kinds of ignominies, forced sterilizations, assimilation programs. You know, there was a particularly fierce attempt made in Australia to wipe out Aboriginal culture altogether. You know, I was talking to an Australian activist recently, and he was showing me the text of a pass that was allowed. So they had this sort of apartheid system. And in order to be allowed to live and work in the cities, an Aboriginal person had to pass certain conditions and show they were civilized enough to be allowed in. But on the wording in their pass basically says this person is civilized enough, they're allowed to be here in daylight hours, but to retain the pass, they have to never again take part in any songs or dances or traditional customs of their own culture. So you can see this really forced and systematic attempt to just wipe out the legacy of 60,000 years of history that came before the British arrival in Australia.
Yeah, it's the very essence of racism, isn't it, to the core? You know, Australia is considering holding a referendum to amend the constitution in order to give indigenous population a bigger say in the country's affairs. But why is this initiative taking place now, and why has it taken so long?
Taken so long because, you know, as soon as you accept that your society is based on this kind of profound injustice, there's a lot of things that suddenly you need to start to re-examine. It's very uncomfortable to look into your past and see what underlies your privileged position today, right? It's not something people are very comfortable, especially the ruling classes aren't very comfortable about, but many of the privileged workers as well are not very comfortable about. And also because, you know, with the economic crisis of capitalism getting so deep, our ruling classes need to accentuate and stir up racial divisions. They want to keep us divided and blaming one another because they want to prevent a unified movement of resistance against their rule at home. And they also need to keep racism of all kinds bubbling along because they're intensifying their war drive abroad. And we're seeing that with rampant Russophobia, Sinophobia across all the imperialist countries today. But, you know, on the other hand, the fact that they are, despite all this, they are having this referendum, I think is a recognition by a growing section of Australian society that this historical injustice does persist to this day and is something that needs addressing.